Hello, everyone. Very happy to meet you all for a new SER webinar on the regulation of platforms and particularly the enforcement of regulation. You know that making progress towards adequate regulation of platforms is one of the key policy objectives of the European Union, of the Commission, of the institutions. And it's clear that it's an objective which is featured very highly on the French presidency agenda. And I'm also pleased to note that for several years now, SER has been at the forefront of the academic work carried out in this field. We've been doing it with regulators, we've been doing it with the platforms, we've been doing it with institutions, with government, and of course, all our work has been done in full independence, as provided for in our bylaws. We've been publishing on several aspects of the problem area. We've also come up with concrete recommendations regarding, among others, the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. And national governments and the European institutions have expressed their interest in our work, and they've participated very actively in our gatherings and interaction. And this is true not only for the Commission, but also for the parliaments. We are in contact with the key MEPs, with the committees, also and also with the member states and third country. And that's why I think we shouldn't be surprised when we look at the EU and member state piece of legislations on platforms. We will often find in the exposé des motifs, in the regulatory assessment documents, reference to SER work. And today we focus on implementation. Clear, predictable rules are necessary to provide legal certainty for gatekeepers and users alike. And the Commission, and we have one of its distinguished representatives here today, the Commission states that the DMA and the DSA will be self-enforcing. So today we are going to challenge that question, to challenge that point, and try to understand: is it really, or what would it need to make it self-enforceable? What does it take to make the system work? And to do that, we have a new report by academic director Alexandre Destrel and research fellow Giorgio Monti, and also Giorgio is a professor at Tilburg, and Alexandre in Namur. And we're going to listen to their report. We're going to follow this with a reaction from Prabhat Agarwal, who is the head of unit in DG Connect, and he's got a strong responsibility, I would say, in the paternity of the papers which are being discussed by the trilogue. And then we'll discuss all this with our panelists, and we're very happy to have. I'll introduce them in a minute. We have representatives from regulators, from platforms, from other tech players. So it's interesting. I think it's going to be a very, very exciting session, and that's why I won't talk much longer. Just say to the viewers, to you viewers, that you can interact. You can interact in this discussion by putting questions on Slido, #SERDigital. And this being said, I give the floor immediately to Professor Giorgio Monti for the presentation of his joint report with Destrel. Giorgio.
Thank you very much, Bruno, and welcome everybody to this session. So I'll present the paper that Alexandre and I have written, which asks the question: having agreed upon the rules of the game, what sort of institutional design do we want to have in order to enforce these rules effectively? If you could move to the next slide, please. These are the three questions the report confronts. So we look at a number of what we call platform laws that are being enacted, have been enacted, are planned by the EU legislator. And we ask three questions. First, how can we ensure effective enforcement? How to strengthen national regulators? How to improve cooperation among regulators? Secondly, we ask ourselves whether it's also worthwhile to have cooperation among authorities operating in different fields. For example, the data protection regulator cooperating with the competition authority, and how this might be designed and facilitated. And then finally, we ask the question, having regard to the developments in the DMA and the DSA, whether centralized enforcement for the biggest digital platforms can be developed. Next slide, please. With regards to the first question, what we've seen in the study is that incrementally, the EU has boosted the power and independence of national regulators through its various legislations, but also the case law of the Court of Justice has emphasized the importance of independence, and you come to the stage where some of the jurisprudence of the court seems to set out an EU-wide principle of independence. Notwithstanding this, we find that different directives and different regulatory frameworks have different requirements as to the independence of the authority, the requirement to have resources, and the powers of investigation and punitive measures that are available. We also find, having looked at the cybersecurity legislative packages, that here regulatory choices may not always be in line with good governance principles. So whilst national regulators' powers are increasingly strengthened, there is a bit of an asymmetry depending which regulatory framework you look at. So our first recommendation in the report is for the legislator to have a template of the criteria that ought to be applicable to all regulators with regards to independence, powers, and resources. And the justification for this is that it avoids then the unevenness that we see in the current regulatory framework, and it forces the legislator to explain why one national competition authority should not have the same independence requirements as all the others. We have enough experience with how to operationalize effective national competent authorities that we should be able to have a list of the necessary independence, resources, and powers criteria that could be applicable across the board, unless there are good reasons not to. Next slide, please. The next segment of the report, we look a little bit at the sort of institutional design models that exist to apply EU regulation, and in this context, digital platform regulation specifically. And there are three. The country of origin model, where one regulator acts for the benefit of all member states. Data protection regulation comes to mind as an example. The country of destination approach, where all regulators are competent when the conduct affects their jurisdiction. Consumer protection is an example of that. And then a centralized model where the Commission safeguards the interest of the EU. Competition law when enforced by the Commission as an example. Next slide, please. What I'm going to do now is take you through these three different models and speak a little bit about their advantages, problems, and the assumptions that underpin these. So the advantage of the country of origin principle is that you have a one-stop shop. The regulated firm is regulated by one national competent authorities for the whole of the EU. This facilitates investment across the EU and integrates markets. A couple of risks exist. The first is the risk of forum shopping. The regulated firm picks the jurisdiction where it feels it is regulated most likely. And also what we've observed in the last few years, there is a risk of under-enforcement if the country of origin regulator is unwilling to act. And one concern we particularly observe in the report is that if there is under-enforcement by the person who is tasked with applying the country of origin principle, then other regulators might choose to apply alternative rules in an imaginative manner to cover the regulatory gap. An example this month is CNIL's action against Google cookies, applying the e-privacy directive as opposed to what would have been expected, the Irish data protection regulator intervening. And this kind of substitution of rules can be somewhat problematic for the regulated firm because we're not using the rules that were specifically designed to cover the market failure, but we're looking for alternatives. The country of origin principle has a couple of assumptions. The first is that the national regulatory authority has the power and the resources to apply EU law, but also that it has the incentive to take into account the interests of the EU as a whole when it regulates and not just the interests of its jurisdiction. Next slide, please. In this slide, we look at the countries of destination. So the advantage of a country of destination approach where each national competent authority regulates for its own jurisdiction is that this can be better in situations where there are country-specific issues. And so it's best that the regulating country A deals with what happens in its jurisdiction because of specific economic or cultural circumstances. The risk, of course, is that you can have different regulatory cultures and potentially different interpretation of the rules if each regulator does things their own way. And the assumption behind this model is that EU law serves to secure convergent enforcement through, for example, references to preliminary rulings at the Court of Justice, which harmonize. And as we illustrate in the report, another way of ameliorating this system is through the use of networks that identify best practices among regulators. Next slide, please. And finally, the centralized model, where the Commission safeguards the interests of the EU as a whole, has as its advantage that the Commission can see the interests of the EU perhaps better than the national competent authorities and can therefore facilitate market integration in a way which is perhaps more effective than the national competent authority. A couple of risks we've identified. First, there's perhaps a perception that the Commission lacks the independence that national competent authorities are bound to have under EU law. There may be limits to the resources and perhaps also limited understanding of the local context. The assumption for choosing the centralized model is that there is conduct which has effects across the EU as a whole, and therefore it's logical to have a single enforcer, and also that there is the ability of cooperation between the Commission and national competent authorities in order to apply regulation. So the point we wanted to make with reviewing these three models, next slide please, is that all of them are present in the legislative framework and all of them have their own strengths and weaknesses. There is no first best model. One thing we've identified in carrying out the case studies is that one way of facilitating the work of national regulators is the development of cross-country networks. Cross-country coordination among regulators has a number of benefits. I've identified three on this slide. First of all, that you can develop best practices and align standards. So different experiences across different regulators can be brought together such that the best approach can be implemented by all. For the country of origin model, cross-country coordination can assist enforcement. And for the country of destination model, there can also be coordination of enforcement. One of the case studies we carried out in doing this report is in consumer protection. And we observe here a particularly noteworthy example, the Consumer Protection Cooperation Network, where if there is a market failure that occurs in more than one jurisdiction, the network of national consumer authorities can get together to find a solution for the EU as a whole. So rather than each regulator targeting an infringement of consumer law in its jurisdiction independently, they do it cumulatively. So it replicates the one-stop shop that you would have with a country of origin principle or with centralized enforcement. In the report, we showed that this model has a few weaknesses that could be addressed, but that overall it is quite a sensible mechanism for implementing the country of destination regulatory frameworks in an effective manner. And our recommendations when we look at cross-country networks are as follows. First, to embed networks into the legal framework, to require that networks are created across all regulatory domains. To expect that national authorities exchange information and devise best practices through the drafting of soft laws. And then we've also identified a couple of models for assisting enforcement to stimulate effective regulation. So for the country of origin principle, we find particularly noteworthy the DSA model of requests for enforcement, where one authority can request that the country of origin authority takes up enforcement. And as I remarked before, for the country of destination principle, we find that the consumer protection network is particularly useful and has potential to be replicated in other regulatory frameworks as well. Next slide, please. When it comes to our second research question, cross-regime cooperation, what we observe is that there are a number of different policy objectives that different regulatory frameworks seek to establish, protecting competition, protecting consumers, privacy, cybersecurity, and so on. And the challenge is to develop some sort of coherence among different regulators which are charged with regulating the same platform, but perhaps with slightly different perspectives and objectives. And a particularly noteworthy model which we've discovered and we'd like to recommend is studied and developed across all jurisdictions. That is the UK's Digital Regulator Cooperation Forum, which brings together, as you can see on the slide, the competition, data protection, financial services, and electronic communications regulators in a framework where all four communicate with each other about how they see the industry developing. They share information and knowledge such as to shape policy in a more coherent manner. There's also an understanding that when one of these national competent authorities enforces its rules, it does so in dialogue with the others. And this allows for some sort of what I call in the slide joined up regulation, so that rather than just applying one rule in its own silos, the regulator is aware of the impact its decision-making processes may have for the achievement of other policies. In this context, it's interesting that the European Parliament's proposal for the DMA suggests the creation of a high-level group. And in the proposal for the European Parliament, this high-level group recognizes the need for this group to go beyond just the competition authorities, but also involve other national regulators to cooperate with the Commission in developing the rules to apply to gatekeeping platforms. Of course, creating cross-regime competition EU-wide is a huge challenge because you have multiple regulators in multiple jurisdictions. So our first recommendation is that each jurisdiction itself should develop cross-regime cooperations modeled upon the UK's Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, which we see as the most well-developed and as a good lesson for everybody else. Of course, then incrementally, one can then see if this can be replicated more broadly EU-wide. Next slide, please. And our final segment of the document looks at the DMA and the DSA, which centralize enforcement for large players. Now, centralized enforcement has a number of challenges. Does the Commission have enough resources? How are these rules best embedded within the European Commission? In the report, we suggest perhaps joint teams of different directorates general. How is information going to be shared between investigations under the DSA and the DMA? And what sort of role is there within this centralized system for national regulators? Some options are on the table in the various legislative drafts. Should national legislators be points of contact for complaints? Should they also assist in investigation? Should they be more actively involved, perhaps, in applying certain provisions of the DMA, for example? Next slide. And in the final part of the paper, we then reflect upon these developments of centralized enforcement in the DMA and the DSA and suggest some more long-term options for how the Union might go forward in designing institutions fit for a digital age where large platforms are present. One suggestion we make is to shift enforcement away from the Commission towards what we call tentatively a European Platform Authority. And the idea here is to create an independent EU-wide agency that deals with the largest platforms as opposed to leaving this to the European Commission. And our second suggestion is to consider whether, in addition to just the DMA and the DSA, one could incrementally think about centralizing other rules of platform regulations in the hands of the Commission or the European Platform Authority. In the study, we look at banking supervision as a possible model for this. We observed there that there was a shift after the financial crisis from decentralized supervision of banks to centralized supervision for systemically significant banks. So more or less the same shift we've seen in the DMA. In this context, the legislator saw the crisis as a window of opportunity for making a radical reform. So the reason why this move occurred in 2009, 2012 is because of the great financial crisis that facilitated, if you want, the legislator pushing for a bold initiative such as the banking union. We also see in this implementation of banking supervision, the important role of joint supervisory teams. That is to say, it's not the ECB that supervises these systemically significant banks by itself, but it does so in tight cooperation with the national competent authorities of each jurisdiction. And the impact, as so far as the studies go today, suggests that centralizing enforcement together with the joint supervisory team has led to a better supervision, or at least a more demanding supervision for banks, and has leveled the playing field. So this suggests that centralized enforcement, well designed, can achieve significant benefits for the effective regulation in this context of the banking market. And we suggest we might want to think about similar things for other aspects of digital market regulation that are not yet covered by the DMA and the DSA. In the paper, we don't suggest an overhaul, but we suggest a careful case-by-case cost-benefit assessment of when it is that certain rules might be best enforced centrally. We use the theory of fiscal federalism to explain that this is not automatic, but it has to be justified by the legislator for each piece of regulation. And we also suggest that even with centralization, it's important that centralized enforcement is done together with national competent authorities. Now, the role that national competent authorities plays can vary. They can be simply supporting the EU body in carrying out investigations, or one could even consider delegating some enforcement powers to the national competition authorities. So the degree of involvement of the national competent authorities can vary depending on what is perceived to be suitable. As I said at the beginning, these are the longer term options that we are suggesting the Commission and others look to in the future as digital market regulation develops. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Giorgio. A very, very timely report. I think it's really on spot on the issues which are really on the agenda now. We're very fortunate that we have Prabhat Agarwal with us this afternoon. Prabhat, as I said, is the head of digital services and platform unit at DG Connect in the European Commission. And I'd like to, Prabhat, there's so many things we'd like to know from you. Obviously, we'd like to know how things are going on in the trilogue, which I started last week. How do you see the prospects for the trilogue? What are going to be the things which are being discussed here? How can we? How do you see the future? Clearly, what we would like to hear from you is what you liked in the report from Alexandre and Giorgio. Perhaps what is not so much to the taste or to the preference of the Commission, to try to put it diplomatically, and of course, I suppose you will perhaps want to start all your comments with a bit of elements of context, in particular behind the DSA. How did you come to the proposals that you are making in your proposal, Prabhat?
Thank you very much, Bruno. So thanks a lot to Giorgio and Alexandre for this very interesting report and for giving me the opportunity to speak here briefly. I have to already start with a small apology that I have to immediately after this short intervention leave this interesting session. But let me just answer some of the pointers that you've given me, Bruno, in the introduction. Let me actually start a little bit with some of our background thinking then that we had, particularly in the context of the DSA, because I think it is there where the institutional setup is perhaps particularly interesting, I would say, and has many of the challenges. Then I'll make a couple of brief comments on the really interesting report. And then at the end, I'll try and answer your challenging questions with the trilogues that you started with. So maybe I'll say at the outset that the report from Giorgio and Alexandre really, in many ways, matched our internal thinking that we had when we were designing both the DSA and the DMA, and many of the questions that are being discussed in very extensively, of course, have been discussed in very similar terms internally in the Commission when we were designing it. So when I was reading it, we were really remembering many of the preparatory discussions that we had also, and many of the problems that we had identified and issues that we had seen are also well reflected in the report. But maybe one thing that I can add is just a little bit of context to our thinking, particularly on the DSA and the country of origin principle, which Giorgio already mentioned in his slideshow. There was one element that is maybe a bit historical. Of course, the country of origin principle, particularly in the e-commerce directive, came about at a particular moment in the history of the internet, if you like, and also in the history of the European Union, because it was a principle that was enshrined in digital regulation shortly after the Schengen Agreement came into force in 1995, and physical borders in the European Union were dismantled, and it was just at the beginning of the internet, penetration into the European Union. People were starting to slowly become familiar with email and some very basic web services at the beginning, and there was a feeling that just like there were no physical barriers in the European Union anymore, there should not be any physical barriers in the internet either. So any virtual barriers, I'm sorry. So there should be no frontiers in there. And therefore, actually one formulation of the country of origin principle, which stems from its historical, it was simply the extension of the freedom to provide services to digital services. So we often speak about the country of origin in the terms that Giorgio has mentioned in his introduction, giving one country's regulator the supervisory power. But the original thinking was slightly different. It was that you should be able to provide digital services, information society services in the e-commerce directive from anywhere in the union to anywhere else in the union without any restrictions, so without any barriers. And that really has a kind of deeply European borderless idea behind it, that there should be no such restrictions. And one formulation of the country of origin principle is simply the freedom to provide such digital services without restriction across the internal market. And I think it is, of course, mentioned in the report, but I just thought that it was important to highlight this historical element, because, of course, this was then goes back to the treaty freedoms to provide services freely across the internal market. And of course, in the late 90s, the need for cooperation between different member states was very different, because these were very brand new services, and there wasn't, the promise of the first, this was even before the first internet bubble, the promise of the internet was such that nobody was really anticipating, I think, the kind of issues that would arise perhaps later on. And that we have now turned to in the Digital Services Act, but of course other pieces of law also before then, they were mentioned in the report very extensively. The GDPR or the AVMSD had kind of taken part of these issues and addressed them beforehand. So the big element of change was not so much to restrict or to change the freedom to provide these digital services in the DSA, but to bring to the regulatory framework a cooperation mechanism that would allow effective resolution of these issues. And so maybe just a compliment also to the report in our own mind. I mean, there were, of course, a number of country-specific issues. Language, for example, I mean, particularly in the Digital Services Act, social media services are deeply linked with language issues. What constitutes hate speech in one country is very language specific, and sometimes not only linked to national laws, but also linked to language issues. And a question that arises, and it is also mentioned in the report, is that can a single regulator actually comprehend whether or not a particular instance is illegal in a particular language content? So there's a kind of country and language specific element, of course, in the issues that we are seeing now in platforms. There's a second element is about sector specific aspects. I already mentioned in the report very explicitly, sector specific issues such as video sharing platforms in the Audiovisual Media Service Directive, data protection issues. We have also special rules on terrorist content, which could deal with could consider a kind of issue-specific or sector-specific approach. But then there's another element in the DSA which is important to bear in mind, is the distinction that we made between systemic issues, so issues of a system of a platform, and individual content items. And so the DSA regulates systems and not necessarily content related issues. And the question that arises with the enforcement and supervisory powers is that it's very different whether or not you are supervising a system. Does a platform have a notice and action system that functions correctly, or individual content specific items? And the third element that I just wanted to highlight a little bit more in our thinking, which is very important for designing the enforcement and oversight structure, is the technological complexity. And here I think the banking analogy is very interesting because as Giorgio correctly identified, we had taken a lot of inspiration from the banking regulation sector, and many of the elements that are in the report were really also at the forefront of our mind. But there are also some important differences. I wanted to highlight three. One is that unlike perhaps in some of the regulated banking industry, the diversity of platforms or gatekeepers in the DMA that we are facing is probably quite a bit larger than in the banking sector. So different platforms will have quite a lot of different issues. Whether you're a social media service, a search engine, or an online marketplace. It's not quite the same issues that we are dealing with. Second thing is that these business models are evolving very quickly, and that's also slightly different from the banking sector. We're now talking about the metaverse or crypto financing and of social media services has been discussed over the weekend in the media. So a lot of this stuff changes very quickly, and so business models change very quickly, and we need an adaptive approach to it as well. And then the third thing is that and there is a similarity, particularly with some of the banking regulation in the high frequency trading area, is that we're dealing with technologically very complex objects. Content moderation algorithms, recommender systems, and we are also dealing with objects that are very data driven. So they are dealing with a huge amount of kind of big data objects, basically. So that actually there I see a certain similarity to the banking sector, but it requires a certain kind of expertise, and I think this is well recognized in the report. I wanted to add these elements because I think this is all well recognized in the report, but I just wanted to share some of our own thinking when we had, and as we are discussing now the enforcement and oversight structure, it's important to take these aspects into account, because practically, and here we are joining the conclusions of the report really very closely, and where we see a lot of resonance with what we've been thinking, is that the country and specific aspects require a cross-national collaboration structure that's effective, quick exchange of information, ability to cooperate seamlessly and across country when something arises. The issue of sector-specific requires what the report identifies as kind of cross legal instrument cooperation as well. So it's slightly different than cross-national cooperation, but this is very, very important. On the evolution of the business models, I think maybe one way of thinking about it is to make a slight distinction between the regulation or the regulatory aspects and the enforcement aspects of the rules. In the DSA particularly, but also in the DMA, we have quite a lot of soft guidance. We have a lot of guidelines and standardization processes, code of practices going on, and they are kind of the adaptive elements of the regulatory framework. They should be able to be flexible enough to adapt to new business models or some of the evolutions. And the enforcement of the rules is, of course, the enforcement of the rules as they are written. Maybe just one way of thinking about this. And finally, the technological sophistication of the regulated entities, in terms of the large amounts of data that we're dealing with, the question of algorithms or recommender systems, that also, of course, implies a very high level of subject matter expertise, that is necessary in the amongst the oversight structures, and that ideally, particularly for the DSA, is something that needs to be pooled across all of those people who have this expertise. So those are just some reflections, and I think that they echo and resonate very much with what Giorgio and Alexandra have written in the report. But I just wanted to put it into the context of how, at least when we were designing the instrument, we were thinking about some of these issues. So really a very useful piece, I think, the CERU report, and has written down in many ways things that we didn't have time to write down into a report, you know, and also it's gone to a lot of detail in more depth than our own thinking has in many aspects. Finally, Bruno, you asked about the trilogues. I mean, of course, we are at a very early stage, you know, happy to share my first impressions. I mean, the first trilogue on the Digital Markets Act kicked off, as you know, last Tuesday. I was in the room. I think it was a very positive first trilogue. It was you know, clear that people were you know, serious. All sides were very serious about you know, about tackling these issues, you know, together at a quick pace. I think we heard you know, very encouraging opening statements from all sides, and as the kickoff of this whole season, I would say, you know, it was a really great start to the year. Of course, on the DSA, we're you know, Parliament still has to agree on its position, and then we will go into trilogues there as well. But I'm overall, you know, really optimistic and encouraged by this, you know, great start of the year, and I think. But we are at it's early days, and there will be many more opportunities to check in. So this is as much as I'll be able to say at this particular point. But thanks again for the opportunity to comment briefly. I hope I've managed to give a little bit our perspective on some of these issues, and congratulations again for a very interesting report.
Thank you very much, Prabhat. Thank you for your kind words. Thank you also for the perspectives you gave. I think it helps us also to understand better, and I think our participants and our viewers to understand where the Commission comes from when it devised the contents of its proposals on enforcement. And it's always nice to hear that we're not so far from what the people who decide and or close to the decision makers think. So thank you very much, Prabhat, and good luck for the next stages. Ça continue. The story is not over. Bye-bye. Now we continue with the panel discussion, and before introducing the panelists, I'd like to remind the viewers that they can put questions. Some of them have already done that. Sorry, they haven't tried, they've done it. And we got the questions. Please mention the name of your organization when you put a question. It helps us. So the panelists whom we're very lucky to have around the ether today are Antonello De Tomaso. If you can just raise your hand. Antonello is Director EU and International Affairs at AGCOM, and he's also the co-chair of the Regulatory Framework Working Group of BEREC. So he's wearing both hats, unless he contradicts me this afternoon. The second panelist is Bailey Ingram, Head of Policy Strategy Europe at Meta. The third one is Gautam Kamath, who's a Senior Manager EU Affairs with Huawei. Laureline Hoot, Director EU Government Affairs from Microsoft, and Camilla Bustani, Director International from the UK regulator Ofcom. So I'd like first, perhaps, ladies and gentlemen, panelists, I'd like to ask you perhaps a brief reactionary statement, let's say. And if you could tell us perhaps in 3 minutes, what something you like in the report, and something you disagree with. So let's start by this. A general view on the report, one thing you don't like, and one thing you love. Let's start with Antonello De Tomaso.
So, yes, many thanks. I will try to meet the challenge of the 3 minutes. But first of all, I would just like to thank you, the SER, and the 2 authors of the study, Alexander and Giorgio, for the excellent quality of the study. It's a very comprehensive, very, very stimulating also for our today's and future reflection. And it is also comes at a very right point in time when we already have several pieces of legislation at European level adopted in the field of digital services, and many of them that are already mentioned in the introduction on the pipeline and in preparation, I would say, from the by the European Commission. Just to try to reply to your very straightforward question, what I like and what I don't like, basically what I like is the focus itself of the report, because let's say thinking of a report dealing with institutional aspects is very important, especially at this very point in time, as I was mentioning, because tailoring a good and effective governance and a distribution of tasks between the different layers, and then we can discuss about the, let's say, geographical distribution, national versus European, but also the very interesting approach dealing with the cross-regime distribution of tasks is very, very important. And I would say personally that it's even as important as the substantive growth, because if you don't really feature the system with effective governance and implementation and enforcement rules, you may write down the best substantive rules, and you will never go to effectively pursuing the regulatory goal that you have considered. I also like, as it was mentioned also by Prabhat, the quality of the analysis, a wide range of examples that have been reported. These are very useful also for us in the day-to-day job to take stock of, just to put you an example, the ACG case law on the features of independence of national regulators, very useful as well, and the recommendation, but I think that, which are mostly share, and I hope that in the next round I can also get a little bit into deep in that. What I don't like, there's nothing really I don't like in the paper, so nothing that I would just like to flag as a matter of concern, but there's a suggestion probably for the future, which has already been somehow taken on board by the author itself, is to look, whenever the time will be mature, to identify which is the institutional model to pursue the digital platform, to a practical way, and to look at the day-to-day implementation of the system. Because as it has been reported by the authors, each model has its own history, its own rationale at the very beginning. Prabhat has reminded us why the country of origin principle is coming from in the e-commerce directive. And I can tell you, putting one of my several hats as national regulator, you know, AGCOM is convergent, so we are dealing with telecom, with media, with postal sector, and now recently also with some aspects of the digital environment. Each own regulatory cooperation model has its own story, and we shouldn't forget to consider things from a practical point of view. So it is good to analyze from a theoretical point of view what is at stake, but then when we have to translate this model into a new model for dealing with the digital service regulatory issues, then we have to consider the practicalities. And I also like the idea from the authors, from Alexander and Giorgio, to submit any kind of even long-term analysis to a very thorough cost-benefit evaluation. Just a few examples from our own experience, as Bruno has reminded also my role in BEREC. We all know that the regulatory cooperation in telecom has a story is dating back from a very early and let's say voluntary cooperation within the IRG. Then it has been formally shaped within the ERG by means of a commission decision, and now we have the structural institutional layout of BEREC. If you follow the story of BEREC, of cooperation in the telecom sector, you see that many of the institutional layout features, but not just the institutional layout, also the regulatory feature. I'm thinking of the scrutiny of the national regulators market analysis, the so-called phase 2, is clearly shaped by the story of the evolution of the cooperation in the sector. Let's think about the role of the guidelines in the current framework.
Antonello.
I'm ending up.
Yes, please.
And so I could say the same for ERGA and the same for the content sector, where it is really important the way to cope with the country of origin principle, which is also identified as a matter of concern in several aspects, and something can be said probably in the next round. So the lesson and the suggestion is not to try to choose the best model, but try to find the most appropriate model, thinking of the current example we have in practice. And hopefully the DMA, the DSM implementation will be very helpful in this respect.
Okay,
that's all for now.
Thank you, Antonello. I know it's the 3-minute rule is complicated, but let's just have, to be impressionistic at this stage, so that we can develop what you have already done, Antonello. Now, perhaps further some of the points. So I'll move to Bailey, Bailey Ingram from Meta. Bailey, what are your the things that you like, the thing perhaps that you like less, and your general reaction? All this in 3 minutes, if you can. That would be great, please. We do not hear you.
There we go. Better?
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Bruno, and many thanks to the SARE team for the huge efforts that I know have gone into this report. It brings a new depth to the debate and is very welcome for doing so. And you ask, why do I like this report? Well, the debate about regulatory design can feel a bit dry and abstract sometimes, but it's actually the cornerstone of the digital single market, as I think Giorgio reflected on it, as did Prabat, and it's hugely important to companies like Meta that operate in it. The frameworks that are being developed now will define the next 20 years of Europe's internet economy, and that internet will look very different to the one that we have today. Meta plans to create 10,000 jobs in the EU to help build the metaverse, a much more immersive internet based on augmented and virtual reality, and we will be just one among many. In fact, it will be European companies, developers, and creators that bring the metaverse to life. And that vision depends also on the success of this new generation of EU regulation, especially the DMA and DSA, harmonizing and not fragmenting the digital single market. 27 mini DMAs or mini DSAs would make investment at scale in Europe harder. And that's why, from my perspective, SARE's contribution is so helpful here, regardless of where the political debate lands on country of origin, country of destination, or centralization across these big pieces of regulation. The most important thing for the digital single market is that there is a form of one-stop shop. And that means a single regulator for a platform to interface with, but also that the one-stop shop works in practice. And thinking ahead to the fast-moving environment of the metaverse, competency and expertise will also become more important from a regulatory standpoint, as will standards around interoperability in particular. So while in the rear-view mirror, one-stop shop is already important, looking ahead with these attributes in mind, I think that will become more so. Obviously, I would say that from Meta's perspective, because we're a global company, but I also say it as a European, the greatest boost to the European tech industry would be the creation of a genuinely borderless market of tens of millions of consumers. So SARE's analysis of the existing mechanisms for multi-stakeholder input and cooperation from BEREC, as we've heard already, to ERGA, to adjacent sectors like banking, to draw practical lessons is a new and thoughtful contribution. What do I disagree with? There are two things that I think have been overlooked, and I'd love to discuss them more today. First, I definitely wouldn't have left the discussion of regulatory dialogue to page 63 of the report, although I'm glad that it's in there. Enforcement means it's too late. Improving the effectiveness and efficiency of EU regulation should start much, much earlier. The second, I really believe the discussion around cross-regime cooperation is so important that the underlying issue of trade-offs that is actually driving this deserves more attention. I see from within Meta that the trade-offs that were already fiendishly hard when you had binary decisions to make around free speech and safety, for example, are actually becoming even more complex across areas like privacy, security, competition, and even the wider economy. And I think a better understanding of that should be fundamental to the frameworks of the future.
Thank you. Thank you. That's extremely clear. Let's move now to Gautam Kamath from Huawei, please.
Hi, thank you, Bruno, and thank you very much for this opportunity. I just wanted to say congratulations, first of all, to the research team, because I was quite blown away with this report. It's not often that you really hit the nail in the head from every angle. And it's very timely as well for two reasons. One is, of course, the raft of legislation that is being discussed at the moment. And secondly, it's really important that we have this discussion. And of course, the focus of the report has been platforms and online platforms. But Huawei is a technology infrastructure company, and we are experiencing some of the same insights that are coming out of the report. And if you ask me, what's my favorite part of the report, one of the core focuses of Huawei and my own work is cybersecurity. So my favorite part of the report really was your analysis of soft laws and how soft laws can contribute to the institutional design in the EU. Specifically with the EU 5G toolbox and the fact that now this is being sort of baked into hard law with the NIS2. You really pointed out the risk, the fact that the nature of the discussion is getting politicized, and the point that if different member states interpret cybersecurity legislation differently, it will lead to fragmentation of the single market. And I mean, this is something we've been feeling to some extent, and while that might be unfortunate for Huawei to be unjustly excluded in some countries, this is not really the main point. The main point really is that there are real consequences on European consumers. I remember there was a study by Ethno, I think about a year ago, that pointed out that less than 25% of the EU had the ability to get 5G, while at the same time in the US, it was almost 75%. And so this fragmentation really has consequences for the EU single market. There's a slowdown in technological innovation, there's a reduction in economic growth, and there is also a consequence on the market structure. So I remember, I think it was June 2020 when Vice President Vestager urged EU telecoms to actually do more cross-border M&A transactions and to consolidate the industry. And I'm just thinking, after reading the report, if there are different requirements on vendors and suppliers, etc., how will these national champions benefit, and how will they get access to the best technology and also economies of scale? So I think that's why this report is really spot on. Just very quickly, what I could fundamentally disagree with, not much, frankly. It's just that in terms of the scope of the report, I think while I understand, the report was limited to sort of consumer laws and core economic regulation, I think cybersecurity is another natural candidate. And just because of what Prabhat said earlier, you really need a high level of subject matter expertise at the EU level to ensure that the digital single market is protected. Cybersecurity is a cross-border exercise. So I hope that the report in the future would sort of go into some of the institutional design challenges in this field as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Gautam. I give the floor now to our friend Laureline Laureline Hood from Microsoft. Hi, Laureline.
Thank you, Bruno, and thank you all to the research team for the great work. What I like most about the report is that it is out there now. I mean, it is very timely. It has been said a couple of times. Digital regulation in the EU is the amount and the scope is increasing rapidly, and that brings with it an increasing number of overlaps between all those different regulations in a cross-sector mode. And that really needs to be addressed. And it's very important. And that brings questions of institutional designs. Add to that, as Gautam just said, more and more providers are operating in cross-border mode, which adds to the regulatory complexity and which really makes all of these questions very urgent. So in itself, really good work, great that it is there, that we have such a report now, and thank you also for the thoroughness of the breadth also of the document. You've been really looking at very different types of regulations. So that in itself is already a great achievement, I think. What I'm maybe struggling with most is sort of, I'm struggling with the fact that it describes itself as a report for digital platforms. And I believe that platforms are a subset of digital services. We look at platforms usually as a kind of service that allows the intermediation between businesses on the one hand and end users, often consumers, on the other hand. So like a marketplace or an online store or the digital online platform as you see them in the DSA. And there are lots of digital services that are not a platform. And that also where we see these questions of regulatory overlaps and cross-border overlaps in the same way, in services that are more in the telecom scope, or as Gautam said, in the cybersecurity area. These are not always platforms, yet the same questions are as important and as urgent for these services. And so I think that maybe with a new version of the report or an add-on report, it would be good to add that nuance. And maybe then also, maybe it's linked to precisely this probably a little bit focus on platform, that in the recommendations we see a very strong focus on or at least a great deal of attention to the solution of the centralized authority, centralized enforcement, and certainly in certain cases that is a good solutions, as you say yourself, with the necessary caveats and so on. But in other situations where we are maybe more in traditional service area, we can I think improve the cross-sector cooperation and the cross-country cooperation. And I think you could refine the recommendations a little bit further in that sense. Now, I think those elements, you make recommendations, but they are maybe a little bit underexposed as compared to the centralized oversight.
Okay, thank you very much, Laureline. I'm sure that we'll come back to some of the points you mentioned in the following discussion. Let me end this tour de table with Camila Bustani from Ofcom. Hello, Camila.
Hello, thank you very much, Bruno, for the invitation to participate in this panel. And just to add my thanks to those of my fellow panelists, to the authors of the report. I think I subscribe to almost everything that's been said by them so far. I think this is an incredibly useful exercise to have taken place. It's very broad, quite exhaustive, but one of the things that I think any good piece of research demonstrates is how much there is left to look at and to analyze. In a sense, it's posed a lot of questions for us to sort of continue this exercise. So if I go back to your questions, Bruno, what I liked, I really appreciated value, recognized value of the regulatory networks over time. I mean, I've been working through EU networks until the UK left the EU, but for about 15 years, and saw it firsthand the value they added. So it was great to see that story told, as you don't often get to see that. And in particular, the recognition that even if we do end up in a situation where there's a degree of centralization for enforcement, whether it's through the Commission or an agency or whatever, that there has to be a continued role for the national regulators, not just because they're the ones on the front face with the experience of implementation on the ground, but also because they continue to be responsible for sectoral regulation that interacts with this new sort of overarching digital set of frameworks. I'm also really pleased to see that inter-regime cooperation has been embraced. It's a relatively new thing. The UK, I guess, was among the first to sort of try to make that happen through the DRCF. And it's great to see that the sort of the importance of that kind of regulatory dialogue is recognized in the context of a broader institutional design discussion. I also am really pleased that in this context of balancing out the role of national regulators and the role of a central authority, that the concept of regulatory innovation is recognized. So it's really important, especially in an area like this where it's new for everyone. We're not yet sure what's going to work and what's not, that we don't inadvertently close off the possibility for regulatory innovation by the regulators themselves as a means of perhaps more quickly getting to the right answer or to effective regulatory responses. What I dislike, I guess, it's not so much dislike as sort of what I said earlier, which is that this report poses a number of questions. I think it's one thing. The report does seem to have a preference for centralized solutions, centralized sort of design. But I think that discussion is really just the tip of the iceberg, and we need quite a lot more analysis and assessment to ensure that centralization is used for the appropriate functions. Because for the DMA, for example, it's got designation, it's got negotiation under Article 5.6, it's got monitoring, and it's got enforcement, and those are very different functions. So that's a whole new area of analysis, maybe for part 2 of this report. And also just to really sort of dig down into how any form of centralization can, in practice, goes back to Antonello's comment, in really practical terms, how we can preserve the really important principles of independence, obviously resource, but accountability, I think, is a really important point we have to keep at the forefront as well, especially as you start centralizing power. It becomes increasingly important, and I'll talk about those issues later on.
Thank you.
So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Camilla. We'll definitely get back to you on that issue of centralization. I'd like to keep the last part of our discussion on that precisely, and you'll have the opportunity to develop your views. Perhaps at this stage, I'll first want to remind once again of viewers that they can come with questions on Slido using the hashtag #SerDigital. I have already one question that perhaps I could put to Alexandre de Strel, asking him perhaps to react briefly to what he heard from the panelists, and also to talk to address one point raised by somebody who's viewing us from Thammasat University in Thailand. His name is Kanokai Twanopanit, and Kanokai is asking us, you don't mention the role of private enforcement. So Alexandre, can you please mention that, talk about that, and react briefly to what you've heard?
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you very much to all the speakers. So, I mean, this report,
was one of the most difficult I have done for SER so far, because, you know, there was a trade-off between breadth and depth, you know, and I think most of the comment, and they are very welcome, told us, okay, maybe this point should have been digged a little bit further, these other points should have been digged a little bit further, and I fully agree. And that was also my frustration in writing the report, is that, and I think Giorgio shared that, because we are all, we like to do deep stuff, Giorgio and I, and he, in a way, we decide to take a little bit of another angle, which is to say, we privilege breadth for depth, because we thought that there was also an interest in looking in an holistic manner in all the regulation of, and there I take your point, Laureline, that it's at the end of the day more the regulation of digital services than the regulation of platforms. So I see your point, and there I agree that maybe the title is a little bit misleading, although you know, those platforms are providing services, but I fully take your point that we deal with some digital services which are not necessarily provided by a platform. So that's a very good point. So there was a kind of a trade-off. We went for breadth, but maybe, as you say, I mean, there should be this report, maybe stimulate other report which will tackle specific issue more in depth. Secondly, I would like really to thank all the contributors to the report, and some of them are, I mean, contributor. We had a lot of exchange, you know, SER is functioning also as a dialogue. And for instance, on the evolution of network, the input of Camilla was very, very important for us. And as we discussed privately, I would advise Camilla to write a book on the history of networks, because I think you are one of the person who knows the best. And it's indeed, it's not very often told, this kind of story of the how those regulatory networks have evolved. But so this is an occasion for me to thank you, and also Antonello on all the history background that you brought. Now, on the comment we have heard so far, I think there are three issues that are very important and that maybe deserve more research from SER. One is on the issue of centralization, as Camilla was pointing, and also as Prabhat was pointing, this is require a lot of high-level expertise resources. And what I have seen so far is that the national authority tends to be a little bit more flexible and agile in having those resources than the Commission. We know that the Commission is notoriously bureaucratic in hiring people, you know, and we have an issue there. I mean, and that's an issue that I hope will be tackled by the Commission, but I think you will not attract a lot of computer scientists that you need with the EPSO concours. You know, you really need to think of a way of attracting good people, and I think that would not be easy, but that's, I agree, an issue with centralization. The second point, this is a point which was made by Laureline about we could have been a little bit go further on our recommendation for cross-country and cross-regime cooperation. I fully agree with that, but that's linked to the trade-off we had to deal with between breadth and depth. But I agree that I would like myself to work a little bit on that and with the people of the network. And the third point, which was mentioned by Gautam, I think is a very important point, and it's a very important point for EU law and for EU construction in general, is how soft law can contribute to internal market. Because what we see, and Prabhat has recalled us, that we will have a lot of soft law next to the DSA and the DMA, really a lot. And so we have to be sure that first, this soft law is, you know, good. And so we need to have a process for the making of this soft law, which is good. And second, that indeed this soft law is a way to have the internal market, and not that everyone is putting its own view on it, and it's just a catalog of national practice. For those who are subscribing to the Cullen services, it's a kind of Cullen which is doing regulatory comparison. It's a kind of Cullen fish, but it's not you know, pushing for the internal market. So I think those are 3 points that we should be careful about, and where we can do additional work. And finally, on private enforcement, but there may be also Giorgio can complement when he will have the word a bit later, because he's a specialist on that much more than I am. The focus of the report was public enforcement. So it's not, we do not think that private enforcement has no role or is not important, not at all, but it's just that in this kind, it was broad enough to just focus on public enforcement. But again, that's a very good point, and maybe we need to do research more on the role of private enforcement in all those laws. I mean, again, Giorgio has worked quite a bit on that in the context of competition law and a little bit for the DMA advice. But I agree that it should also be another, but that would be another piece of study altogether.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alexandre. Giorgio, we'll get back to you a bit later on this, on the last point. I'd like to move immediately to the issue of cooperation on enforcement, and I think it's important. It would be useful for our viewers to understand what are each of our panelists' views and stance on the importance of cooperation within one regulatory regime across country, and also when we talk about cooperation across regulatory regimes. Who would like to start on that? Laureline, please.
I can start. I think it's an extremely important topic, which I already indicated in my former contribution. So the cooperation across countries, the report does a great job in describing what models we see. And maybe I can just spend some words on the telecom model, because the report actually describes BEREC as a good model, right? And I think indeed it has strong merits, and it's an achievement what BEREC has done. Yet I think with the increasing internationalization and cross-border activities of companies, we need to think a little bit more, even more ahead. I think we still have a tendency to look at, okay, is this a sector that is cross-border, or is it a sector that is national? Whereas if you look in the telecom sector, originally it was very national, but nowadays you see more and more B2B providers who operate across borders. The telecom scope has been widened to include OTT services. They are just always across borders. So I think that within a sectoral regulation, there should be more room to look at which operators are national and where is national regulation fit, and then we can organize the cooperation as we have it already today, and which operators operate really in a cross-border mode, where the cooperation à la BEREC is not enough, where you really need to look at, do we go for the country of origin model? Do we go for an increased harmonizations of the rules? There are different solutions possible, but I think we need to go one step further. And the CER, the proposal for the CER directive, CRR, is interesting because it introduces this nuance to say, in certain, look at in how many countries are operators active, and depending on that, we put them under a national regime or under a more harmonized regime. I'll leave it there. I still have ideas on the cross-sector cooperation, but I think that is a way to go for the cross-country cooperation.
Thank you very much. Useful contribution, Laureline. Let's move now to Camilla and then Gautam, and perhaps we'll ask Antonello then after to give perhaps a BEREC perspective. Camilla,
thanks
please.
very much. Thanks. So I think one of the reflections that I had to add a little bit of, I guess, color to this analysis is about when you set up a sort of cooperation, whether it's intra-country or intra-regime. It's important to bear in mind that it's not something that you can design or engineer and then you flick the on switch and it starts to work. It's an incremental process, and it requires the gradual development of mutual understanding and trust between ultimately human beings, right? So it's very much about the relationships and building those relationships supported by these sort of institutional structures. And I think a key part of this is, in the context of intra-regime cooperation in particular, is recognizing the fact that the different parties are starting with actually different public policy objectives, as is noted in the report, and that can actually determine quite different regulatory cultures. So you've got, competition authorities and economic regulators concerned with promoting competition. That's a completely different universe from audience protection from content regulators or privacy protection for data protection regulators. And I think it's important to bear in mind that one of the purposes of inter-regime cooperation is actually just enabling that conversation really up front. That's certainly the focus of DRCF in this first year of operation. The second point I'd like to just emphasize, which I think is noted in the report, but I think is really critical, is there's definitely the question about incentives when you need regulators to sort of take actions to support the needs of other regulators for enforcement. But I think we shouldn't forget that you actually need to think before the incentives is, do the regulators have the necessary legal powers and actually legal duties to act, to play their part, whether it's to share information across borders or across regimes, which their statutory framework might not have been designed with that in mind, or to play some part to expend some resource on behalf of another regulator in another jurisdiction or in another regime. I think it's really important to get that, because without that, an NRA's own constitution could potentially stop it from acting, even if it wanted to, because if your duty is defined in law as in relation to your national citizens and consumers and limited to a particular sort of set of functions, then if you try to divert resources to go beyond that, you might get judicially reviewed in court. So the other thing I would like to say was, you might not be surprised to hear from me in the UK, but I think it's really important that we remember that cooperation goes beyond the EU. And I'm not just saying that because the UK wants to stay in the conversation. I think the UK is actually the easiest case because our online safety bill is genetically related to the DSA. Our digital markets regime is going to be genetically related to the DMA, but there's a lot happening beyond Europe. A lot of, not quite as advanced as Europe, but in Australia, there's been quite a lot of activity, even in the US, where there is a, relatively speaking, a regulatory vacuum, but we've had a number of bipartisan legislative initiatives around potential introduction of ex-ante rules for platforms, as well as transparency obligations on social media companies. So you can really see that we're all kind of converging into the same area, and ensuring that we have the sort of institutional mechanisms to not just enable, but actually, proactively promote cooperation beyond the borders of the EU is really important. First, to help ensure that the emerging regimes are compatible, since as has been noted earlier, it's the same platforms, and we need to minimize compliance risk and compliance friction in order to enable greater levels of compliance. Also, to share emerging insights and best practices, because again, same platforms, pretty much the same services, and this will help mitigate risks like forum shopping or one regulator being played off against the other. And then eventually, when we've got established regimes, if they've been able to evolve in a compatible way, then it'll make cooperation to support investigations and enforcement much, much easier. So that's my contribution on the question of enforcement. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Camilla, for this. Let's move now to Gautam, please. Gautam Kamal.
Yes. First of all, those were great comments, Camilla, because it's exactly what I was thinking, especially your first point on the fact that cooperation is really down to the human element and building trust over time. And I think that's a really key point, because there's often assumptions that if you have sort of soft law instruments, or if you have a lot more mechanisms for cooperation, that you end up with a more harmonized sort of set of outcomes, let's say. and that's not really necessarily the case. So in the case of Huawei, for example, the implementation of the 5G toolbox, it's a fact that it has led to more fragmentation, not less fragmentation. So that's sort of the main point. And we notice that the key point also is consistency with the objectives of the regulation. You made another very important point, which was different stakeholders have different agendas and they come at the problem with different angles. And if you see that this sort of divergent outcome set in the EU 27 is a result of those disparate sort of agendas and outcomes. Just to think about reflecting on the way the 5G toolbox is being implemented, there are differences in terms of the measures itself, the balance between the technical and non-technical measures, broad definitions versus narrow definitions, and also there was an interesting element of cross-border cooperation with a powerful third country. So I think there's a lot of different elements to consider, and it's a very important question also because as we look forward and the implications of all of this legislation sort of trickles down into outcomes for citizens, we need to think about the EU strategically and from the perspective of the EU strategic autonomy as well. So I think that those are really the key concerns, and I think your report is touching on all of them.
Thank you very much, Antonello. What's your take on this? Of course, you have the experience of network of cooperation between regulators. How do you see the things here?
Yes, and yes, I can probably pick up some of the points I briefly made in my first intervention. But first of all, I would just like to stress the importance that the study puts on the two concept of cooperation, which is cross-sectoral and cross borders. I don't think we need to add anything else on cross-border regulation, especially when it comes to digital services. It's pretty clear. Then how to solve these cross-border issues? We have different models. I mean, the country of origin, the Commission has explained, I mean, where they were coming from, and it's pretty clear also looking at this recent proposal that without, let's say, withdrawing in general terms the principle of country of origin, they really realize that there's some need for adaptation. This is even more the case for the digital sector, because it is not just a matter of individual NRA's incentives or powers or tools, but also is the ability at all for a few NRAs to cope with a wide number of players, which, as we know, are located for several reasons in one or two or very few European member states. So it's even a new set of issues posed by the country of origin. The country of destination actually, to our own experience, has been working well. And again, I can refer to the telecom sector, which has been already touched by somehow by Camilla. Obviously, we recognize the fact that in order to deal digital issues, a more centralized approach would be needed. And in this respect, since Bruno has mentioned my role in BEREC, I would be glad to just to share with you what you probably already know. We have investigated collectively possible ideas and solutions to develop further regulatory cooperation within our own proposal on the DMA. I'm speaking about possible list of tasks that individual NRAs can help developing in order to ensure an effective enforcement. And this leads me to the second point, which is the one of cross-regime cooperation, which is even more important in the digital sector. We all understand from the European Union proposal at stake that sectoral regulation is there to stay in several sectors. I mean, telecom, media, data protection, even, not just economic rights, but also fundamental rights. So it is important that cooperation among sectoral regulators is ensured in order to make sure that the horizontal digital regulation will be not at odds, not contradicting with the sector regulation. So in this respect, I also believe that the role of the NRAs and their own cooperation platform at the European level would be very important. I will just mention in this respect again the proposal that BEREC has raised in order to have this advisory board, which is somehow now I see quite closely reflected into the European Parliament proposal. The DSA already provides us a more sophisticated description of this kind of cross-sectoral and cross-regime, cross-sectoral and cross-border regulation, and also the recent proposal for a regulation on political advertising already provides and highlights the need for a cross-regime strong dialogue between the NRAs or the bodies who are in charge for political communication, freedom of information and freedom of speech, and the data protection body as far as the targeted information issue is concerned. That's all I wanted to say. I think that we can probably have another round of very, very quick points on the way this cooperation can be done. I would just like to underline a specific point which has been made by Alexander in his own intervention, is the importance and the flexibility, more flexibility, so to say, that he mentioned the NRAs have in comparison with the Commission to attract resources, to high competences, the ones who are needed to tackle digital services. Yes, this is somehow the case, but very often NRAs have some natural, let's say, rigidities, and I think it is very useful to consider the recommendation, the first recommendation that has been flagged by the report, to have as much as possible a common set of features for independent NRAs in terms of independence, in terms of regulatory capacity, and the ability to attract the resources, not only have financial resources, but also attract human resources and skill. This is very important. I think this is something that we should elaborate further in the near future.
Thank you. Thank you. Obviously, this is a fundamental point. The ability to have enforcers who have the competence to do the job, and we know how challenging that job is and is going to be. Just moving now to Bailey Ingham, please.
Yes, thank you, Bruno. I just wanted to come in on this knotty question about cross-sectoral cooperation and just why it's so important, and maybe add to Camilla's call for a follow-up report from this brain trust. I think there's two areas here. The first is that we're seeing macro issues which have societal and economic consequences being tackled by topic-specific regulators right now. And one example of this would be the question of transatlantic data flows, where following the dissolution of Privacy Shield, the issue of how to find a legal basis for transatlantic data flows is falling to privacy regulators using the privacy toolkit. But other objectives are not able to be taken into account in that case, such as the economic consequences to the future of the European economy. The second, which I think is really interesting, is that actually the new pieces of regulation that are being developed are actually creating trade-offs within themselves. So if you take the DMA, for example, an obligation to require GDPR-style consent to combine data between services is driven by a desire to give users a specific type of privacy control. But the question is then, how does that weigh up against the user experience if they are required to opt into sharing their, or consent to sharing their data for multiple different purposes? You have 5 services, you would need to give 5 different data users, you need to give 100 different consents. That kind of question would usually be dealt with within the GDPR and the balances that that piece of legislation strikes. But now it's under the DMA, which actually the driving objective of the DMA is market contestability, and doesn't provide very much of a guide to answer that question about user experience and so on. So I think that these questions that sort of presented a little bit at the beginning, the sort of genesis of this is in the report, would be great to explore further.
Okay, thank you very much. Laureline, I think you wanted to make a short comment on cross-sector cooperation, please.
Very brief. I was triggered by Camilla's point that saying that yes, such cooperation requires trust between and exposure between authorities. Yes, truly, but I do think that with the new instruments, and I think Bailey also referred to that, for example, in NIS, we see explicit obligations to check certain elements with certain authorities. And I think that going forward with the increasing amount of regulations that we are having, it will be necessary. And it would also help if the Commission would make that, take that factor clearer in its impact assessment, I think, for example, because just the trust and the general cooperation and talks, which is absolutely necessary, going forward won't be enough.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's move perhaps now to the last part of the discussion, and that is the issue of centralization of power. I'd like to know your views, dear panelists, about the form of centralizing power when it comes to enforcement. How should that power be centralized, and where should the centralization take place? At the level of the European Commission, in the hands of a possible European platforms authority? What are your views on that? Who wants to start? Gautam, please.
Thanks, Bruno. I think it's a very complicated question, because in my opinion, it's really about what you're trying to regulate, or which aspects are you trying to look at. And I think there are two ways you can decide whether or not a certain topic needs to be centralized or with national authorities. One is, of course, the competences that exist for the EU based on the treaties. But of course, it's also really important to think about the objectives of the regulation. Like, what are the regulatory authorities, institutions trying to achieve? The NIS is a great example, because NIS 2 exists because one of the key concerns expressed by industry, by citizens as well, was that there was too much fragmentation. There wasn't a common baseline, let's say, that goes across the sector that can be meaningful for both industry and for SMEs and for citizens. So I think that is really how we should seek to strike the balance. It should be about proportionality and thinking about the subsidiarity principle enshrined in EU law a little bit more carefully, rather than prioritizing sort of political objectives.
Okay, thank you. Bailey, what do you think about that? We don't hear you. We don't hear Bailey. So we'll move to Antonio, to Antonello.
Okay. So
Thank you.
No, I think I mean it's pretty. I mean, I think it's clear what are my views on the basis of my former intervention. I really believe that a form of, let's say, enforcement should take into account the specificities of this specific sector and, how can I say, freedom and rights at stake. And so I don't know if it is something they refer as a semi-centralized approach would be pursued with a clear and effective role in the transposition by the NRAs. My understanding is that to some extent the Digital Service Act provides to some extent this kind of semi-centralized approach with some specific matters whose enforcement is left to the central level, but in other areas and in the overall implementation of the system, there's a specific role for the NRAs, also taking into account and assuming that each member state will keep the prerogative and to decide who is in charge for which specific regulation at home. So in the end, there are several rights that can be, let's say, discussed and would deserve a European centralized approach, but in other areas, I'm thinking of the freedom of information, the hate speech that had been also mentioned in the beginning by the Commission, a specific and let's say clear involvement into the enforcement would be advisable at national level. I am not sure if this is the idea because listening to Lorelei and Camilla's remark, when my reading of the paper is that basically the paper is rather neutral at this point in time, and any kind of discussion of a possible long-term approach to centralized enforcement is yet to be developed. But since I understand that the other speaker's reading is inclined to see a sort of a preference of the authors towards a centralized approach, I would just like to take what I like in the report and to stress the fact that whatever decision to go for any kind of fully centralized approach, the agency, the Commission, or even a model just like other sectors ones need to be really carefully considered in terms of a cost-benefit analysis. So this is something I would just like to point out. I think this will be the last chance to speak for today, and another aspect I would just like to flag for further discussion is to look at this topic also in a broader global dimension, and this has been also pointed out by the authors, because the European dimension is fundamental, but it is not enough. So we are at the very beginning of the story, and I hope that there will be further chances to discuss these institutional features also in a global dimension.
Thank you very much. Let me just say something about that, Antonello. And perhaps inform you and the viewers that SER has in fact started last October a very, very ambitious and very exciting project on the global governance of the digital ecosystems. This is a project where we want to understand how possible it is to converge between the various regulatory initiatives in the digital area, which are being taken in various parts of the world, and in particular in Europe, in the United States, and in China. We are also including there Brazil, India, and other jurisdictions. And we've gathered a team of high-level academics, including, of course, our own team of academic directors, co-academic directors, but also senior scholars from Asia, from America, and from other parts of the world, and a number of very remarkable people in a steering committee. And we hope to come back to you on that, hopefully after the summer break. But this goes exactly in the direction that you are calling for, Antonello and others. have also mentioned that too. So with that, I'll give the floor to Bailey. I hope she hears me now and we can hear her. Bailey.
I hope so. Am I back? Okay, great. Yes, thanks, Bruno. I actually wanted to set aside a little bit the question that's still going through the political process about whether power should sit with the Commission versus the member states and how that works, just as that plays through a little bit, and maybe look ahead if the Commission were to take on such a role, what kind of things need to be taken into consideration. And I think this is, again, slightly under discussed maybe in the report about what kind of safeguards such a powerful regulator would need to have, and how what the consequences of that regulator would mean for enforcement regimes in member states, which would presumably need to be limited in order to make sure that there was harmonization. So I think a discussion about what the due process around a different type of commission, whether that's under the way that it's envisaged in the DMA, or some of the discussions that are happening in the DSA context, would be really valuable.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps to close the tour de table, we could ask Camila to give a view. I suppose it's either a third country perspective, but in any event, we know that it's the views from an acknowledged international expert in these matters. So Camila, please.
Thanks very much. Yes, obviously the UK and Ofcom don't have direct interests in the specific nature of the sort of design of the EU regulatory regime, but we certainly have a sort of indirect interest because, as I mentioned earlier, we all need to cooperate with each other, and so it needs to work for everyone. But I think I just wanted to sort of highlight a few things. I think I mentioned earlier that whatever the version of centralization, and for whichever particular purpose, whether it's to increase harmonization or if it's to deal with the very real challenge that Antonello pointed out, where you've got a very strong concentration of stakeholders in one or two jurisdictions, it's really important to make sure that, as well as the various sort of best practice design principles that Bailey's mentioned, that accountability is really front and center. The more distant from the ground, the more important that becomes, whether it's the Commission or an agency. The sort of more layers you create, the more important that becomes. And again, just to sort of reiterate the point I made at the very beginning, making sure that the regulatory networks and the national regulators are really hardwired into the system, because their inputs and their exposure, in fact, to what the centralized authority will be doing is critical to make sure that the entire system continues to work. Just a couple of reflections on the discussion on the design of the centralized enforcement. I mentioned earlier that it's sort of the tip of the iceberg and raises a number of questions. It was almost sort of made me think, okay, well, where's the next chapter? Because there's still so much more to tease out. And I look forward to seeing that in subsequent reports. One of them is to do with the sort of inter-regime cooperation point. And obviously the authors acknowledge very clearly in the report the importance of cross-regime cooperation at the national level. They mentioned DRCF and the Dutch equivalent sort of network. But then when they come to talk about centralization, potential centralization of powers at the Commission level, they talk about a task force between DG Connect and DG Comp, perhaps inspired by the Article 7 task force from the original telecoms framework. But in digital, what about DG Just? What about DG Grow? What about the various DGs that are interested and invested in all of the other sort of public policy areas which are engaged by digital regulation? I mean, obviously, data protection is the key one, right? Because data collection, use, and processing are at the basis of majority of the business models that are going to become subject to regulation under these two pieces of legislation. So I would love to sort of see that explored a little bit further and how that might actually be made to work, whether at the Commission level through a task force across DGs, or indeed, if it were to come to designing an agency, how you would do that. In fact, yeah, I won't kind of expand on that because we'll run out of time. But the other point I wanted to raise was, again, I think that because of lack of time and having to draw a limit on the length of the report, there's only a very light reference to the legal constraints around developing agencies. And, you know, we are familiar with the Moroni Doctrine, which restricts the ability of the Commission to delegate certain discretionary decision-making powers to EU agencies. And the authors talk about that, and they look at the most recent interpretations of the Moroni Doctrine by the ECJ and point to actually executive agencies which are consistent with the Moroni Doctrine, which are compliant, and which do have certain decisions to take, certain powers to take technical decisions or adopt technical documents. So in banking, for instance, or in energy. But I think the issue with Moroni has always been about the delegation of the exercise of discretion, discretionary powers. And I think both the DMA and the DSA, despite the Commission asserting that they'll be self-executing, I think no one really believes that's entirely true. I think they are both, by definition, involving the exercise of discretionary powers. And so what I would really love to see is an analysis of to what extent the functions that are anticipated for an authority, whether it's a centralized authority under the DMA and DSA, whether they would actually qualify under the very narrowly defined scope of executive powers which are allowed to be delegated under Moroni. I think that's sort of the next area to look into, to see whether, frankly, an EU agency is even feasible as a solution to the challenges that have been very clearly described. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Camilla. We're coming close to the end of this session. Before Giorgio and Alexandre close, perhaps I see that Gautam wants to make a very, very short point. Please, Gautam.
Yes, I just wanted to respond to this suggestion that Camilla made on sort of using technical standards as a way to enhance cooperation and enhance outcomes. I think this is a really key point because there's a reference in the report to the fact that cybersecurity specifically is not being looked at through the lens of better regulation. I think there was a EU toolbox for better regulation, also called the Toolbox, in November last year. And I think that's a great document because it really outlines some solutions to some of the challenges that we were discussing. Namely, in cybersecurity, you have standards and certification and what we call the NLF. And I just wanted to point out that some of the NIS2 discussions have focused on removing the delegated act powers, which are sort of enshrined by this NLF framework and better regulation guidelines. Moving away from that and giving more implementing act powers to the Commission. And I think this is another example of what Camilla was talking about. Just wanted to point that out. Sorry.
Thanks very much. And the final is Laureline for 1 minute too. Please, Laureline.
Yes. So I think with centralized oversight or supervision, you solve certain issues. You aim to solve, for example, the harmonization, but in principle, you do not solve the cross-sector problem, unless, of course, you want to combine areas. But there, I think you should be very careful. I mean, I have difficulties imagining that we will end up with one digital authority doing copyright, AVMS, ECC, cybersecurity, competition. Is just too much, I think, and too widespread. And then 2 more points. With the centralized authority, you need to think of the coherence with the national authorities. That's what Camilla also said. You need to ensure cooperation. And secondly, you need to make sure that the requirements that are well put out in the report on the independence and so on also apply to the European centralized authority.
Thank you very much. Now let's get back to my colleagues, Giorgio Monti and Alexandre de Strel. What do you guys take away from all that? Giorgio.
Thank you, Bruno. Well, thank you all for your very helpful comments. There's a lot to think about and a lot to respond to. So I'm going to be a little bit selective in my responses, and I'll go in reverse order. So let's start with centralization. I think a really important point a number of you have made is that centralization needs to then go back to the cross-regime challenges, because simply creating a central regulator doesn't obviate the point that you still need to coordinate across sectors. And I like the suggestion that rather than, as we did it in a high level, to say, I think the court's case law can be pushed to make Moroni a little bit thinner, one actually studies it case by case and asks what would exactly this central regulator be doing and how far can this be consistent with Moroni, rather than doing it at a high level. Of course, the report foresees that safeguards and accountability of this new agency would be strengthened. To a certain extent, that's kind of one of the advantages of creating an agency, because at the moment, you know, if you look at the Commission applying competition law, it tells the other agencies to be independent when it is not. The ECM Plus directive mandates that. So creating an agency would create greater pressure to have comparable safeguards than the kinds of safeguards you'd have at national level. On cross-border issues, on the global aspect, one forum where you see excellent cross-border cooperation is in merger control, where competition authorities collaborate in everything from market definition to remedy design to timetabling. So to investigate how that framework manages to be so successful in allowing multiple authorities to cooperate at the same time under a fairly tight time scale could be worth thinking about. What is it that makes that work? I totally agree on the cross-regime challenges that you've identified. All of you spoke to this. When I was doing the report, we looked a little bit at the United States, where there are models of cross-regime cooperation. And even there, with a single language and with a moderately similar legal culture, there are significant barriers to cross-regime collaboration. So even the secondary literature we looked at in the United States suggests this is a major challenge. So to a certain extent, the points that you've made that this is really about enabling cooperation, facilitating trust, are, I think, the key building blocks, at least for the short term, before one gets to imagining joint rulemaking or somehow more complicated designs, like the point that was made about the fact that the DMA plus the GDPR doesn't maybe work very well in achieving the objectives of the DMA, and that one could have a more reflective way on how one piece of legislation should affect the interpretation of another. And then on one final point on cross-border enforcement, I think one point that a number of you have made is that we now have a country of origin system which maybe doesn't cope with large multinational companies that are located in one member state. So if you go back to Prabhat's historical account of the origin of the free movement of the country of origin with free movement of services, there you had fairly small providers. But also this historical account shows up one original sin of the country of origin principle, which is the assumption that the regulator in the free movement of services context would take into account cross-border effects. And a number of studies in the 1990s showed that this was not actually the case, that mutual recognition is fine, but on the other hand, it's not as if the national regulator takes into account the cross-border effects. So some way of stimulating the country of origin regulator to have greater powers to deal with larger firms, greater capacity to deal with the cross-border effects needs to be thought about. I mean, I think one point the report tries to show, and I think the comments suggest, that each model we pick on has its own costs and benefits. So we're not here trying to suggest here's the silver bullet that solves all the regulatory dilemmas. And then I had one more just very quick point to make. Some of you discussed the last few pages on the regulatory dialogue. Of course, that sort of came across as something through the research that definitely needs much more development, but this was not really the paper to do it. But I think indeed, beyond just institutional design is a cultural question as to whether we go for a deterrence model or a model based on more dialogue.
Okay, we lost you, Giorgio. Giorgio, we lost you. You were mute.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm back. Sorry, I clicked something. On private enforcement, just briefly, yes, the paper was not about private enforcement. I think one of the questions to ask is, how does private enforcement complement public enforcement, rather than it just being something out there on its own delivering corrective justice? And so one needs to think strategically about when to stimulate private enforcement in order to make sure that the public enforcement is not harmed by it. So one model would be some sort of follow-on. So in the DMA context, for example, a finding of infringement under the DMA could allow a follow-on action by those who were injured. And another thing we should think about is not just litigation, but also alternative dispute resolution mechanisms that can be put into place to facilitate speedier dispute resolution. Often the damages claim comes too late for anybody to be satisfied by it, but a quicker intervention to iron out an issue that arises when one supplier wants to work with a platform can be designed, and it can be found in some EU legislations. For example, the P2B fairness regulation requires ADR. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Giorgio. When I listen to you, when I listen to the panelists, and I read very carefully the report, I see two things, and perhaps Alexandre could react on that. The first one is that clearly everybody praises the report and the way the researchers balanced depth and breadth. But the second thing is clearly that there are so many points that could be followed up for the next generation of projects on this kind of topic. So, Alexandre, perhaps in your takeaways that I'm inviting you to express, perhaps you could include what are the issues that you think could be the topic for subsequent projects. Alex.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, that's the beauty of those debates, and they raise more questions than they give answer, but that's also the business model of CERT to some extent. So
you bet.
So no, but I mean there is different things. So first, I want to go back to the point that Prabhat started with, which is the complexity, and he mentioned several consequences, and I see at least two. One is on this agility of the regulators, and I think and I think that's a very complicated stuff for the regulator, and on which we should probably work. This is requiring a change of culture, and to some extent, I think the regulator should move from a bureaucratic culture to a kind of a geek culture, which is not easy at all. And my perception so far from what I have seen is that the authority of the member states seems at this stage to be better able to do that than the Commission so far. But we will have to see. But I think that's a key point. And I like also the suggestion of one of you who said maybe we should also, in terms of requirement, that we have common requirement that we have for national authority, that they should be agile. So it's not enough that they are independent. That is obviously very, very key. But also maybe we should think about a new requirement around agility. A second point is that Prabhat mentioned is the role of soft law, and he sees soft law as a way to have a more resilient legal system, and that's right. And soft law is also a way, as Gautam has mentioned, to ensure harmonization, or it's a coordination tool. So I think soft law can achieve both goals. But it's very, very, very important that soft law is made according to the better regulation principle that Gautam was mentioning before. So I think really here also we have a more research to be done of what is the role of the soft law and how soft law is made. The third element is on this centralization. So really, I think we see centralization as a second generation of institutional integration. I think the first generation, as Prabhat has recalled us, was the country of origin, okay, where you had a small company who wants to provide its services all over Europe and to have a one-stop shop. Now we are facing with a new challenge, which is a very global company which are providing the service cross-border. And I think that is requiring another form of integration. And, because sometimes people see the country of origin as the graal of the European integration. And I think, and that's what also Giorgio mentioned with this original sin of the country of origin, is that it's not always deliver. And I think centralization may be another way of having European integration, a more effective way of having European integration. And then on the last point, which probably we need at CER, as everyone else, to work more on those cross-regime coordination. And there I like very much the point which was made also before about, each legal framework has its own trade-off, and the question is how those trade-offs, when one legal instrument is imported in another, and I like the example of Ingham where she was mentioning the DMA, which is importing in a way the GDPR trade-off, but with other objectives, how that is playing out. And I think this issue of cross-regime cooperation should address, and I think that's what the UK DRCF is doing, partly, and they do other things, but should discuss those different trade-offs and whether it's seen in a different way. And I think it's very complicated, but it's something we really need to do. And then there is the global project, but you mentioned that, Bruno, as well.
Okay, thank you very much. I see that there are so many other topics we could have talked about, perhaps discussed more. I'm thinking about private enforcement. I'm thinking about regulatory dialogue, but I understand that these are topics that we will certainly at CER have to revert to, and we'll be considering that. At this stage, I'd like to thank everybody. It's really, I must say, I'm very fortunate because it's great and so easy when you have to moderate a panel where all the members are experts, have the ability to express themselves clearly and to put their views. So thank you very much to the five of you. Thank you very much also for my two colleagues who really have done I think a super job, Alexandre and Giorgio. As I said, we are really right spot on the issues which are on the agenda of the institutions. I'd like to thank the viewers for having been with us. I've seen that we had nearly 300 people who registered to this event today. So I think this is good. It shows that what we do corresponds to the needs of the people. I'd like to mention the upcoming events that you will see on your screen. I suppose that's it. So you see them there. We really look forward to sorry, we really look forward to seeing you. It's about reaching net zero, regulation to rethink and drive system integration. That's on the 18th. Another one in our, and that was part of our energy and sustainability practice. Another one, what future for Europe's offshore renewable energy sector, is also very topical. And then we have another session at the end of the month on the 26th on the state aid for broadband network and on the guidelines. I remind you, viewers, to subscribe to the newsletter, to follow CER on social media, on LinkedIn, on Twitter. And I think it's 2:31, and with 1 minute late. Thank you very much to all of you, and hope to see you soon in our activities. Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care of you and take care of others.